Morning, everyone. Thanks for making the time and thanks for being here. Let's see. We'll talk about managing B2B identities. My name is Suresh Friedman, and I'm a product manager. Yeah, I guess. I manage AWS Cognito, and my pronouns are he, him, and just. Oops. Okay. I basically am from the Bay Area, so when I'm not working, you'd usually find me outdoors. I run a lot, trek, hike, and my highlight has always been a trip I did to the Everest Base Camp about 4 years ago, just a couple of years before COVID. Plan to hopefully, going to do one more. And after you, Jeff.
All right, good morning, everybody. My name is Jeff Baskerville. My pronouns are he and him. I've been working at Trend Micro for the past 7 years, most recently focused on platform capabilities like user identity. I was supposed to say something personal so I could make a real connection with everybody, so I wanted to let you know that I am a terrible juggler, but I probably won't spontaneously start juggling, so the folks who are not sitting in the front row, I see everybody sitting in the back, you're all completely safe. I will not throw this clicker at you. So I am from Trend Micro, but I'm not here to try to sell you anything, but I am going to tell you a few things about our solution to set some context for my part of the conversation. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about Trend Micro Cloud One and where we were. So Trend Micro is a cybersecurity company. We have products and services that help customers improve the security of the workloads that they run in the cloud and on premises. Cloud One brings together a number of those services into a single platform. In March of 2020, we launched Cloud One with 2 services, Workload Security and Network Security. Workload Security had been live under a different name for a number of years, so at launch, we kept its identity system as a way to help customers transition into the new service, but from the very, very beginning, we were committed to shifting identity to a partner so that we could focus our energy on a core business. It took us a little while to make a decision on who to partner with and get started, but in August of 2021, we started onboarding new customers exclusively into Cognito. By then, we had also added the rest of these services to round out the portfolio. A month later, we started offering customers the option to migrate into the new identity system. So we ramped up that migration effort over the subsequent months, and 2 weeks ago, actually, we were able to turn off the old identity system, so now we are fully using Amazon Cognito. It's been a real journey to move our identity system to Amazon Cognito, and today I'm going to share some of the things that we've learned on that journey and the decisions that we made along the way. I'm hopeful that sharing some of what we've learned will help make your own journeys a little bit easier. As mentioned on the previous slide, we started with a homegrown identity system. This was really a matter of necessity more than preference, as we had thousands of existing customers that we wanted to bridge into Cloud One. We knew from the start that we wanted to partner with a team that saw identity as their core product so that we could focus on our own core product. The old system, it was good in its original context, but with the new platform, we had an opportunity to address some customer pain points and remove some of the complexity. With the old system, customers logged in by providing their name of their tenant, their username, their password, and their MFA token value. For large customers with multiple tenant accounts, there was no way for a customer or a user to know which tenants they had access to, and they really had to maintain separate login credentials into each tenant account. Switching between tenants meant that you had to sign out and sign back in again, which customers really did not appreciate. We wanted to flip things upside down so that customers and users were the starting point, and the user-to-tenant relationship was many-to-many. We wanted users to be able to sign in with their credentials once and then be able to switch between the tenants that they had access to. We also wanted to make sure that we had verified contact details for all the users. In the old system, we only verified contact details for the person who created the account. If that person moved on, it was actually pretty difficult for us to find a contact for the account. In the new world, though, a user's email address is their user ID. So every user has a contact address that we've verified. One thing in the old system that was popular with a small segment of our customer base was we had very fine-grained control over password policies and the ability for customer administrators to reset user passwords or MFA tokens for users in their tenant. We looked at the metrics though, and we made the hard choice to not bring this functionality forwards into the new system. We replaced it with a common password policy across the board and self-serve workflows for individual users so that they can recover their own password or MFA token without involving an administrator. And I'm going to hand it over to Suresh to talk a little bit about Amazon Cognito and multi-tenant SaaS solutions.
Cool. So we'll start with a little bit about what Cognito is and multi-tenancy in general, right? So if you think of let's take a step back and kind of look at SaaS basics, right? There's obviously going to be some mechanism by which you onboard users and onboard tenants, onboard users. There's going to be, once the user's onboarded, there's going to be an authentication mechanism. These authentication mechanisms could be, password policies, MFA, so on. But the high-level users are trying to access a service, and the service has some, essentially data that's stored, and you need to make sure that there's proper tenant isolation. This is like at the high level exactly around SaaS basics, if you will. So one of the most important notions here is to basically look at SaaS identity, right? Because this differs from the actual identity that you talk about for a specific application. You need to have the user identity context as well as the tenant ID, and the two together is basically what you need to identify a particular user for a specific tenant. So if you think about with the multi-tenancy, there are a couple of different flavors in which you can actually achieve this isolation. The first one is basically where it's more like a siloed approach, a silo model, where you have a SaaS environment and resources are dedicated. And that doesn't mean it's all resources, but specific resources could be dedicated. And the data, for example, it could be around compute, storage, any of these. But each tenant has its own dedicated set of resources. And essentially, there's still a common element, which is around provisioning of the users, deprovisioning of the users, and stuff like that, which basically differentiates it with, from a managed solution, system. The other approach is basically a pool model, where resources are actually shared across multiple tenants. And what you land up with is a system where, you do not have a specific set of storage or compute or anything that's dedicated to a particular tenant, but across shared across the board. And multi-tenancy in this instance is basically where the classic things that we actually find, right? Where you have runtime policies, and these runtime policies are the ones that actually dictate who has access to what. Now, let's look at some of the options, and how do you actually figure out what works for you? And of course, there's a third one, which is a hybrid mode, and we'll briefly, I'll mention that in one of the examples. But if you look at it more from a identity management perspective, one of the things I mentioned was you need to have the user identity and the tenant identity together in order to figure out who has access to what, right? So in a siloed mode, you basically have, you can get away with, I'd say one of the advantages is coarse-grained isolation. Think of it this way. Each of these tenants have the ability to set their own policies around passwords, around, what the strength should be, whether or not MFA should be enabled for all users and things like that. And what we've also seen is that there are certain industries where there's broader customer acceptance, regulated industries where environments where customers are more conscious about the kind of data that they actually have and so on. And you have better tools as well, alignment of tools, fundamentally because you can choose what you want from a management of identities perspective. But there are certain cons, deployment, because each tenant is on its own, which means anytime there's a change that you need to roll out, you need to roll it out across all the tenants. You need to make sure they're all consistent. And obviously that also leads into higher cost, management cost, and management obviously is overhead plus cost. And there are limits to the accounts that you can actually have as well. And one of the bigger I'd say cons here is the fact that you're not utilizing the resources optimally. Because if you look at a pool model, There is better sharing of resources, which means if you have peak loads, you can actually adjust accordingly and you basically have resources across. But if you're basically going with a siloed model, then you have to make sure that you're always planning for the highest limits and so on. So there's more planning that you need to do ahead of time. The second, of course, when you look at how do we look at isolation? When it comes to policy-based, you're actually setting policies across the board, which means there is, you get more fine-grained in terms of the policies, what's the tenant, what is the application, so on. So you basically are able to do it at a much finer-grained, policy level. Because you're resource pooling across multiple tenants, it also provides you with better resource, utilization. It's across the board more efficient. And gives you flexibility as a result as well, because you don't have to always plan for peak loads. You're going to have different, periods when you'll have peaks, and you still be able to leverage resources accordingly. And of course, when you look at some of the disadvantages, there is lesser acceptance, particularly when you look at regulated industries, and when people need more control over the options that are actually provided. And it kind of, in some ways, it's a mix of technologies as well, right? So the account limits, obviously, you're going to get issues like noisy neighbors and stuff like that, that kind of, has an impact on your deployment. Now, we'll take a step back, and this is more at a high level that we spoke about. Let's look at Cognito, and then I'll transition into how Cognito translates into each of these, multi-tenant approaches. So Amazon Cognito is a simple way for you to say add, sign up, and sign in into your applications, right? So typical, setting up of users, basically allowing them to log in, say, using social identities and so on into your web applications or mobile applications. And there are two parts of Amazon Cognito. One is basically the user pools, and the other is the identity pools. And for all practical purposes, today we'll be I'll be talking more of the user pools and how it's used in multi-tenancy. So the user pool, think of it as a user directory. It basically has the ability for you to store attributes of users. You can basically, it also has, think of user pool as almost like a directory, a repository where you can store attributes of users. You can set up login per user pool. And there is also the notion of an application client. So each user pool can have multiple application clients. And I'll come to these when we talk about the multi-tenancy models. And one of the things you also have is a hosted UI, which is, think of it as a built-in simple login sign-up screen. And the key is when users log in, you actually get a JWT token, and that token is the one that's actually used in order to provide access to users. And then there's identity pools, which is basically the ability for you to get scoped access to multiple AWS resources. Now, let's look at the approaches to multi-tenancy in Cognito. So the first one is attributes. Every user pool has the ability for you to store information about users. And you can actually have things like custom attributes for a particular user. So when you onboard a user, if you remember, we spoke about SaaS identity, which is a combination of the tenant ID and the user ID. So what you'll end up doing in this kind of a scenario is if you basically use a custom attribute, and the custom attribute is going to be, will identify the actual tenant. And so you can use the user identity, pick the tenant ID from the custom attribute, and that hence gives you the ability to kind of authenticate the user to a specific tenant. Now, the second one is groups. So if you think about it, I can actually create users and groups the way you would do in normal directories. And each group, you can actually pool users in a user pool in a specific group, and that group can depict a tenant, which essentially means that you can now have multi-tenancy based on the group the user is actually logging in with. And it makes it you essentially are managing the entitlements at the group level as opposed to managing at the user level. The third is the application client. If you remember, I mentioned that every user pool actually has an application client. What you could do is you can create one application client per user pool. So what would happen is at the point at which the user is authenticating, you basically look at the application client to which they're authenticating, and that is essentially used as the application client information is used as the tenant context. The fourth one is user pool. What you do is you actually create a user pool per tenant. So you basically have multiple tenants, which means multiple user pools, each user pool dedicated to a particular tenant. And finally, you have completely isolating information about the tenant to an external storage. Maybe it's database, whatever the approach is. So what you're doing is you have all the user identity information managed in Cognito. You have the tenant identity information managed in an external resource, and the two together is essentially what you use in order to determine what is it that the actually users have access to. So if you kind of go back to how we classified it, the attribute or the group and the application client-based approaches are all pools, because the pool mode of multi-tenancy. Because what you have is essentially a single, you're using a single user pool. You're basically using attributes or group or application ID information as part of that in order to figure out multi-tenancy. The user pool per tenant essentially depicts a silo approach, and the externalization is more of a hybrid. So how does this translate into tenant isolation on Cognito itself? What you would land up doing if you're basically taking the silo approach is you create a user pool. Each user pool has its own set of policies. These are custom policies, and these custom policies define what your password policy should be, password expiration should be, whether or not multi-tenancy is required for all users, things like that. You basically have custom policies. The advantages are that you now have more control over the kind of policies that you use for a particular user pool. There's better isolation. But of course, there's also the flip side. So, each time you have a user login, because, for example, let's take an example, right? I'm a user who logs in I could log in as a student, as a parent, or as a teacher into a particular environment. Each time I have to get provisioned into each of the tenants, because each of these are separate tenants. And which means every time I log in, there's got to be a mapping process that happens. So there is some processing involved. That also has limitations on scale, because you're evaluating all these policies based on the tenants. And it's an atypical, OAuth flow, because OAuth flow is more around, having a single user pool. That's kind of the approach that OAuth is kind of designed for. The pool approach is you have a user pool, you have shared policies, and there's no need for, some of the clear advantages is you don't need to have a mapping of a user to a particular tenant, and that kind of removes some of the overhead. It's more in line with what we typically see with most of the typical OAuth flows, and potentially scale, because, yes, you're evaluating policies, but you still have the larger resources that you're basically leveraging, from the service itself. And of course, the flip side is you cannot have custom policies, right? And because you can't have custom policies, it means each of the tenant administrators have lesser control over what they actually can define for that particular tenant. And the isolation, we kind of spoke about this in the beginning, which is how much of isolation do you want to achieve? And in specific industries, are customers comfortable with that? So that I'll hand back to Jeff in terms of how they're using Cognito.
Thanks, Raj. Sure. Alrighty, so let's talk a bit about Trend Micro's journey to Amazon Cognito. So let's talk about Trend Micro Cloud One's journey to Amazon Cognito. And the clicker works. Yes. oh, crap. Sorry. No swearing on YouTube. So we had some decision points that we had to think about before we were setting out on this journey, right? So we had three things that we mainly thought about. Which identity provider should we use? What multi-tenancy approach should we use? And at the last one, whose token should we use? Let's talk about that first question. Which identity provider should we use? So we had an identity solution before, and I'm sorry, I'm just gonna pause 1 second and increase my font size here just a smidge. All right, we had an identity solution before and it worked fine, as I mentioned in the context that it was built in. But with the new platform, we wanted to address some of the friction that customers had reported to us, as well as some of those internal pain points that we have been experiencing ourselves. People can build literally entire careers on doing identity management right. Suresh and the Cognito team are a great example of that. We wanted to find a trustworthy partner that understood how we worked so that we could shift this undifferentiated heavy lifting to them. We built a list of 25 criteria for our evaluation. I've built this wall of text for you don't need to read it here. I'm going to actually go through it. There were a lot of things for us to think about. Our customers care about where their data is stored, so we had to think about data residency and data sovereignty. We wanted to automatically migrate our users, including their MFA token seeds. So we were looking for a vendor that could support that migration. We were also looking at whether vendors could support the number of users that we wanted and that we needed to support, and what limits they put on identity providers and identity federation. We wanted to know about some advanced topics like user lockout, re-enabling, maximum session duration, token encryption, some requirements that I'm going to call obsolete, like password history and password rotation, that unfortunately some industries still care about. We wanted to know if we could customize the sign-up process to reduce the effectiveness of bots, customize the workflow UI to match our brand experience and our brand requirements. We looked at the sample code that the vendors provided to see how difficult was it going to be for our developers to build something that the customers could use. We looked at pricing models. We looked at what we expected the solution to cost. So as it turned out, our basic requirements were going to be met whichever platform we chose, and some of our more advanced requirements were a problem literally everywhere. One of the compelling features, though, aside from sort of the basics from security, reliability, and compliance, was CloudFormation support and lead time. Right? Our teams are super heavily invested in CloudFormation for our infrastructure definition, and we really love the way that Amazon Cognito let us use our existing pipelines to spin up Cognito environments just like we do for literally any of our other infrastructure in AWS. We were able to build out a prototype Cognito service stack that used our standard pipeline tooling in literally days. And actually, that's probably more conservative than I should say, because I think it really just took us a few hours to build out that first stack and get it up and running. Literally, spoiler alert, we chose Amazon Cognito. Not because it scored 100%. Nobody did. None of the vendors did. But it did score the best on our criteria. So we answered the question about which identity provider to use. Our next question was what multi-tenancy approach to use. Suresh talked a little bit about the options that are out there. And here's the things that we thought about when we were building out our solution for Cloud One. Some multi-tenancy solutions require customers to contact support in order to really get going. Like if you want to set up identity federation, like the question earlier, you often need to confirm or reserve a domain name. Right? You say, my users are all going to log in with this email address domain, or they're going to log into a separate sign-in URL. Right? We want customers to be able to fully self-serve and set themselves up without needing to talk to us at all. Right? Anytime that we saw a workflow that involved contacting us, we looked for ways to make it possible or even easy for customers to do things literally on their own without opening a ticket. We also wanted to make it easy for customers to switch between accounts for those customers who do have multiple tenants. So we needed a model that would allow us to easily map a user to the accounts that the user could access. Some of our customers told us that they want to have more than 1,000 accounts. And that's Cloud One accounts, not AWS accounts. Right? So it's literally with us. So they wanted to fit their internal organization model, and some users would actually need to be part of all of those accounts. We'd heard that their feedback for maintaining separate credentials for every tenant was not cool. Right? Our goal was for users to sign in once and to have quick access to all the accounts that they're a part of. So tens of thousands of customers, some of whom potentially want thousands of accounts, potentially hundreds of users per account. We didn't have any appetite for having tens of thousands of separate user pools. Separate user pools wouldn't have worked either for sharing identity across tenants. Similarly, using Cognito groups to represent account membership in the user pool wouldn't scale very well. The way that groups work is that the group ID gets put into your identity token. So we couldn't put potentially 1,000 group IDs into a Cognito identity token. And we didn't want to put any limits at all on account membership. So we decided to manage account membership in our application, that hybrid model that Suresh was mentioning. So we built a single user pool and put account membership in a separate DynamoDB table. When a user creates an account, they are automatically a member of that account, and they can invite other users to join. With our solution, users can be in an arbitrary number of accounts without affecting the identity token size, and we can have an arbitrary number of users in every account. So I'm going to repeat the title of this slide. This is not our data model. However, it does illustrate the relevant data and gives you an idea of what we do. We have separate items for each user's membership in each account with attributes reflecting the user's role and some of the data that they entered in Cognito. We have a process that synchronizes the data from Cognito into the DynamoDB table, and I'll show you a picture of how that works in a minute. It's really easy to query which accounts that a user has access to, and we can grow the list of accounts that the user is in arbitrarily. It's really, really simple. It's all in the same DynamoDB partition. So let's get back to our questions. Next one is, which token should we use? I mentioned that we started Cloud One based on a pre-existing SaaS solution. We had thousands of customers, tens of thousands of users in the old identity system. Cognito has a really great mechanism to migrate users into a user pool, but the migration trigger doesn't work when the user has multi-factor authentication. Lots of our users had multi-factor authentication. We needed to create a bridge to help existing customers keep working while we onboarded new customers into Cognito and encouraged folks to migrate over. During the migration period, customers had the option to log in using the old identity system or using Cognito. Once they authenticated, we exchanged their identity token, wherever it came from, for a Cloud One token. We updated our services to accept Cloud One tokens using a shared Lambda authorizer that is referenced by our API gateways. Services are completely and utterly isolated from the mechanism that users use to sign in. The Cloud One token embeds information about the account that the user wants to work with and their role in that account. If they want to switch accounts, they can get a new Cloud One token using their Cognito identity token without re-authenticating. So that really quick switching between accounts is super easy. We also wanted to limit the scope of where personally identifiable information is shared. By defining our own token, we can be really certain that the information being passed to our services is completely free of sensitive data, while we're also keeping useful information in the Cognito token for use in our core identity services. So what we chose is to issue our own token with selected details from Cognito. So you've been really patient. Thank you all very much. Let's explore the architecture a bit. I'm going to show you some pictures now. So this architecture diagram shows how we've configured Cognito and how our customers interact with it. If you look right in the middle, you'll find Cognito. And we've implemented a proxy function and AWS WAF in front of Cognito for additional protection against denial of service attacks on Cognito itself. And the proxy function also lets us extend Cognito with new behaviors that we wanted to implement, like validation for user attributes. You can find a lot more information about the proxy approach if you follow the link on the slide. We've got a blog post up there on the AWS blog. And that's going to be there even when I click, so you're good. Otherwise, the Cognito setup itself is pretty standard. We've implemented a pre-sign-up trigger to help us do some fraud prevention, post-confirmation trigger to categorize users when they confirm, custom message trigger to make our emails a little bit nicer to look at than the plain text defaults, and a pre-token generation trigger to customize that Cognito identity token and also to sync user data into our internal IAM system. This is that sync that I was talking about earlier. and that internal system uses an Amazon DynamoDB global table. So that was step one, signing in. Step two, once we've got the Cognito token for the user, they can interact with the account service to list their available accounts and get a Cloud One token for the account that they want to work with. The account service validates the Cognito token using the JWKS content that we retrieve from Cognito, and it reads account membership information from the global table in Amazon DynamoDB. Something that's perhaps a little bit subtle in this diagram is that every region we operate in is independent. It's completely independent. Once a user has a Cloud One token, they can operate in the region without any dependencies on any other regions. And once they have a Cognito token, our only cross-region dependency is on the JWKS endpoint. We could really easily remove that runtime sort of cross-region dependency by storing the JWKS content in an S3 bucket in the region, but so far we've been able to avoid that additional complexity. Let's move on to step three. The last piece in the puzzle is interactions with our other security services in Cloud One. These interactions are authenticated using the Cloud One token that the user got in the previous step, and we have another custom authorizer that double checks the user's state in the account. We do this check so that if a user is removed from the account or if their role is changed, then we pick up on that change immediately. We don't have to wait for the token to expire. So I'm just going to sum up. Our architecture has really three parts. First step, authenticate with Amazon Cognito. Second step, exchange the Amazon Cognito token for a Cloud One token. And the third step is perform authorized operations in Cloud One. So I'd love to say that this was all rainbows and unicorns all the way through, but we did have some challenges as we went through this process. And there were a few times when we had to do some reflection to make sure that we were on the right path. Some of the challenges we encountered were these ones here. Having a single user pool means not only what the person asked earlier about having everybody in one place, but it also means a single password policy. I mentioned earlier that our old system gave customer administrators a lot of control over the password policy and their tenant, as well as password resets and even MFA resets. Our new system doesn't let them do that because users do not belong to the tenant. Right? They're just associated with the tenant. What this meant is that we had to build out self-serve recovery mechanisms that we didn't need before, and we had to work with those few customers who had customized policies to make sure that their needs were going to be met. Switching out our user identity system to use verified email addresses also meant that every single user had to create an identity in the new system. This took more than 9 months to make happen, and some of our customers were pretty unhappy with us that we put them through that pain. If you're here in the audience and you're a customer, I'm sorry I made you do that. On this side of the transition, though, I'm actually really thrilled by the results, and customer feedback is pretty positive now, but it was a struggle to get people across the line. The next one is identity federation and multi-tenancy. SAML integration is probably a whole separate talk, but our approach to multi-tenancy didn't fit well with how Cognito wants to work. We couldn't trust customer-provided identity providers and give them the ability to arbitrarily assert user identities across the entire system, so we had to build our own SAML support. And that actually talks directly to the question that was asked earlier about federation. Every tenant separately defines which identity providers it trusts, and there's no way to contaminate the user pool with identities from the customer's identity provider. So let's move to, we're kind of wrapping up here. Let's move on to some things to think about. Thank you again for your patience and attention so far. I'd just like to summarize some of the key things that we learned that you might want to consider when you're thinking about your next multi-tenant project. For us, I expect that Cognito can meet the needs of most projects with the built-in capabilities. For us, we had to build something that's a little bit more complex to support the requirements that we had and the experience that we wanted to give customers. If you're building entirely new, you might be able to skip some of that migration complexity, but if you're migrating from an existing system, how do you want to make that migration happen? Next, what user experience do you want to support for your multi-tenant model? We wanted to have a single sign-in URL and full self-serve operations. Some other models use separate URLs or require a member of your team to be involved in tenant onboarding. How strict are your tenants about password policies? Do you need the complexity of multiple user pools, or can you creatively meet customer expectations and customer requirements with a single user pool? And the last one, and like I said, we didn't really have time to talk about this, but consider how or if you need to support federated identity in your model. Can you trust your federated identity providers, or do you need to implement something to insulate your core system from them? The last one, if you have access to AWS support, absolutely reach out to your support team and book some time with an Amazon Cognito solution architect. They're a fantastic and amazing resource, and they're super helpful to work with. I'm going to give you some bonus links here. First one is the Cognito docs for multi-tenant best practices. They are an amazing resource for more detail on what you heard earlier from Suresh. Next one is a link to the blog post that I mentioned earlier for protecting and extending Cognito. And the last one is, if you're interested in experiencing what I described, you can sign up for a free trial of Trend Micro Cloud 1 by following the last link here. And I wanted to thank you all very much for listening today. And if you want to connect, we'd love to continue the conversation. Thank you all very much. And just a quick reminder, please complete the session survey. It is really important that you do that, fill it out. We're going to read all the comments, and your ratings and stuff go directly back into the system for feedback. And that's it. We're going to take a few questions off to the side, but thank you all so much.
Thank you. Thanks.